What happens when one of Hollywood's most famous comedy stars sits down for what everyone expects to be a simple interview, only for everything to go completely off track? What happens when a talk that is supposed to promote a new movie suddenly shifts into a tense back and forth that nobody in the room was ready for? This is the moment when Adam Sandler ended up walking out of the Today Show during an interview with George Steph, and honestly, you need to hear how all of it actually happened because the mood inside that studio became strange fast, and the tension was almost heavy enough to feel through the screen. The whole thing began like any normal interview. George Stephanopoulos greeted Adam Sandler with a friendly welcome, and Sandler walked out with that relaxed, easygoing vibe he's known for. The audience clapped softly, Sandler gave a small wave, and he sat down across from George. Nothing in those first few seconds suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. George kept a bright smile and said, "Adam, it's great to have you here. You've got a new movie coming out soon, and people are excited. But before we get to that, I want to ask you about something that has been talked about a lot lately. There has been a lot of conversation about comedy in today's world, and some of your older movies have been criticized. What do you say to people who think some of your past work hasn't aged well?" You could see Sandler's face change just a little. Not a big shift, just enough to show he noticed the direction of the question. He nodded and answered calmly, "Look, George, comedy has always been about taking chances. Comedy makes people laugh, and sometimes it pushes them a bit. When you look back at comedy from 15 or 20 years ago through today's standards, of course things look different. But judging old comedy by new rules doesn't feel fair to the artists who made it at the time." George leaned in and said, "But don't you think creators have a responsibility to think about the effect their work has? When some people say certain jokes in your past movies were offensive or harmful, isn't it worth reflecting on that?" Sandler rubbed his chin and replied, "Thinking about things is fine. I think about my work all the time. But here's the thing. I made movies that millions of people enjoyed. They laughed. They watched them with their families. They had fun. So when someone tells me that I should apologize for making people happy, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me." The crowd grew quiet. George continued, "I'm not asking you to apologize for making people happy. I'm saying that maybe some of the humor, some of the ways certain groups were shown, maybe those deserve another look." "Would you make those movies the same way today?" Sandler shrugged and said, "Probably not, because everything has changed now. But that doesn't mean what I did back then was wrong. It just means the culture moved, and that's normal. Culture always moves. But I'm not going to sit here and rip apart my own work because some people decided, years later, that they want to be offended by it." George responded, "It's not about people choosing to be offended. It's about people who felt genuinely hurt by certain jokes or portrayals. When humor uses stereotypes or makes some groups the target, that can have a real effect." And that's when Sandler's tone became more firm. He said, "Okay, George, let me ask you something. Have you actually talked to people from those groups who watched my movies? Because I have. People from all kinds of backgrounds have come up to me saying they loved those films. They laughed. They didn't feel attacked. They were entertained." "So who exactly are you speaking for right now?" George answered, "I'm not speaking for anyone. I'm asking questions people bring up. This is a conversation happening everywhere right now, and since you're a major voice in comedy, what do you think matters?" Sandler said, "My view is that comedy is fading because people are scared of upsetting someone. Nobody wants to take risks anymore. You know why my movies did well? They were funny. They were silly. They weren't trying to follow every rule. They were trying to make people laugh, and they did." George said, "But success doesn't mean a movie can't be criticized. Something can do well and still contain harmful ideas." Sandler shook his head. "Harmful? These are comedies, George. Silly movies where people fall over and say dumb things. If someone watches one of my goofy characters and comes away feeling harmed, I honestly don't know how to respond to that." The tension grew stronger. George shifted the conversation. let's talk about something more recent. Some critics say your last few movies haven't shown much growth. They say you aren't pushing yourself. Do you think you're coasting on your name now? Sandler gave a laugh, but it had no humor in it. Coasting? I've been making movies for 3 decades. I've worked with great directors, great actors. I've made hits, misses, and films that became cult favorites. When someone says I'm coasting, what they actually mean is they didn't personally enjoy my latest movies. And that's okay. Not everything is for everyone, George said. But don't you want to challenge yourself? People loved your dramatic work in Uncut Gems. It proved you can act seriously when you choose to. That comment hit a nerve. Sandler said, when I choose to. What is that supposed to mean? You think I'm not acting in my comedies? You think making someone laugh is easy? Comedy is one of the hardest things in performing, and you just brushed off 30 years of it like it's nothing. George tried to explain. I didn't mean it that way. I meant that your dramatic work was powerful, and some people wonder why you don't explore that more often. Sandler interrupted. Because I don't want to. Because I like comedy. I like working with my friends. I like making something that brings joy into the world. Why is that so confusing? Why does everything have to be some deep, serious piece of art? Sometimes things should just be fun. By now, the studio was completely silent. George said softly, of course things can be fun, Adam, but you also have a platform you could use. Sandler cut in again. My platform is comedy. That's what I do. I make people laugh. And if that's not good enough for you, then maybe there's no point in this conversation. George looked surprised. I do respect comedy, Adam. I'm just trying to have a discussion. Sandler cut him off again. This isn't a discussion. This feels like an interrogation. I came here to talk about a movie, and you've spent the whole time asking me to explain my career, justify my work, and say sorry for things I don't feel sorry for. George said, Adam, you're being very defensive. These are real questions. And that's when Sandler stood up. You know what, George? I think we're finished. George held out a hand. Adam, please sit. I'm not trying to attack you. I just want to talk about things that matter in entertainment. Sandler stayed standing. People are dealing with real problems, George. Money problems, family issues, stress. When they come home and watch one of my movies, they relax for a little while. That's important. That means something. And you're treating it like it's some silly, shameful thing. George tried to calm the moment. I'm not saying that. I'm asking you to face criticism, which comes with your job. Sandler replied, I can take criticism, but what I won't take is this attitude that comedy isn't worth anything unless it matches some serious standard. That's not how I work. George motioned to the chair. Please sit down so we can continue this like adults. Sandler looked offended. Like adults? So now I'm childish because I'm not sitting? You don't hear how condescending that sounds? George said, I'm sorry if it sounded that way. But I'm doing my job. These questions are important, Sandler said, and my job is to make movies I believe in. When you question whether I'm serious about my craft, when you imply that I'm wasting my talent unless I do drama, that's insulting. George said softly, that's not what I meant. Sandler said, it is what you meant. You brought up my old movies to call them problematic. You brought up my new movies to say I'm lazy. You brought up my dramatic work to say I should do more of it. When were you actually planning to talk about the movie I'm here to promote? George looked uneasy and said, we were getting to that, but there's context. Sandler said, the context is that I've made people laugh for 30 years. I've hired hundreds of people. I've made memories for families. That's the context. George said, but comedy does evolve, and we should talk about how. Sandler cut him off. Then talk about it with someone else. I came here for one reason, and you changed it into something else entirely. George said, if you sit back down, we can find common ground. Sandler shook his head. You're not my enemy, George. But you're not acting like a friend either. Friends don't lure you in with one plan and then switch it for another. George looked hurt. I'm not ambushing you, Sandler said. You're pushing me into answers you want. And when I don't give them, you press harder. That's not a good faith conversation. George said, I push everyone equally. Sandler said, except you don't talk to dramatic actors like this. You don't tell them their work is not serious enough. You treat comedy like it's less valuable, and that's part of the problem. George said, this isn't about drama versus comedy. Sandler said, yes it is. Because you think comedy is the easy stuff. You think it's less meaningful. You think it's something that needs to justify its place. George said, I never said that. Sandler interrupted, you don't have to say it. It's in the way you're asking these questions. George sighed, so all the concerns people have about representation, stereotypes, you think all of that is just noise? Sandler said, some of it is real. Some of it is people pretending to care because it's trendy. George said, that's a convenient excuse. Sandler said, it's not an excuse. It's the truth. And I won't build my whole career around trying to please people who never liked my work to begin with. George asked, how do you decide who has valid concerns? Sandler answered, I decide for my own work. You decide for your interviews. That's how it works. We both live with our choices. George said, we also have to think about how those choices affect others. Sandler said, and I do. But I'm also responsible to my audience. They like what I make. I don't make movies for people who don't watch them. George said, your work reaches millions. That gives you influence. Sandler replied, and I respect that. But influence doesn't mean I throw away everything that makes my style what it is. George said, we're just repeating ourselves now. Sandler asked, so can I leave, or are you going to try to stop me again? George said, you can leave anytime, but walking out sends a message you may not want to send. Sandler narrowed his eyes. What message? George said, that you can joke about others, but when someone asks you hard questions, you can't handle it. Sandler turned slowly. I've never run from anything. I've had critics for decades. I'm still here. I'm not running. I'm refusing to be part of something disrespectful. George said, if you feel disrespected, I'm sorry. But I stand by my questions. Sandler said, and I stand by my answers. You just didn't like them. George asked quietly, so what now? Sandler said, now I'm done. He walked towards the exit. George called out, Adam, you're really leaving? Sandler didn't respond. He lifted his hand in a small wave and walked off the set. The audience was still, the studio frozen for a moment. George turned to the camera and said, well, a broken bar that was unexpected. We'll be right back. So what do you think happened here? Was George asking fair questions? Or did he push too far? Was Adam Sandler right to walk out, or should he have stayed and talked through it? Let me know what you think about moments like these where celebrity interviews go completely off track.